welcome to another edition of the Mediatwits. I'm Mark Glaser, Executive Editor of PBS MediaShift. Today we'll be talking about news apps with a news app showdown between Yahoo News Digest, Circa, NYT Now, and we'll also talk a little bit about Al Jazeera's new AJ+. We've got a whole new kind of crop of news aggregators out, and they're doing a lot less there's a lot more kind of human intervention and human choices going on among news apps. And also, how will they kind of tailor themselves for the new Apple Watch and wearables? First, I want to tell you about our sponsor. We're hosted and sponsored by Next Space and Next Kids in Potrero Hills, San Francisco. They offer co-working space and adjacent daycare for infants and toddlers. Learn more about their pioneering program at bit.ly/nextspaceph. You can learn more about NextSpace co-working spaces around the country at nextspace.us. In fact, I am currently at NextSpace, and my baby is next door. Everett is next door at the Next Kids area, so it's a nice setup here. So before we get into our discussion, I want to introduce our panel. We've got Andrew Lih from American University joining us, David Cohn from Circa, Chief Content Officer, David Perpich, General Manager of Digital Products at New York Times, Fannie Cohen, our producer in New York, and Nick D'Alessio from Sumly, now Yahoo News Digest. Nick, you started Sumly, in your kind of preteen years, and sold it to Yahoo. So you've gone from being kind of a young entrepreneur to being part of the Yahoo team. You have about, from what some reports say, 2 million downloads of the Yahoo News Digest. How is it? How has this trip been for you, going from, early entrepreneur to now being part of a huge tech giant?
So it's been very fun. I mean, I started Trimit, which later became Sumly, when I was 15 years old, so a few years ago. It's been an amazing learning curve. I'm just excited I get to continue building products. I've been doing this as a hobby since I was a lot younger, since I was 12, and so to take Sumly, be acquired by Yahoo in March of 2013, and then produce this new app, Yahoo News Digest, that we launched at CES earlier this year, has been a really fun time as a process to work with the editorial team at Yahoo, the Yahoo laboratories, kind of on the science side of things, and then to culminate that, I think, with some exciting things later this year. So, for example, winning the Apple Design Award, that was a nice bit of validation. So I've learned a lot from the process. There's a long way to go, and we like to iterate, but it's been a fun journey.
And now you guys just came out with a version for iPad as well, and I guess Katie Couric is a part of that. I mean, I know your initial vision was to really kind of limit what people can see in these kind of 2 editions that come out each day. I mean, literally almost like a newspaper edition where you have a morning and evening edition, which seems a little old-fashioned to people. What have things changed now with the iPad app? You're kind of adding a lot more stories and kind of taking a little bit of the limits off?
No, I mean, not at all. So the iPhone and Android product is identical to what it was. So the paradigm is, twice a day, once in the morning, once in the evening, when there are actually session spikes in terms of news consumption anyway. We provide you with these definitive, finite digests. You get that moment of completion. You can read all the top stories. And the premise is, if you read our app twice a day, you don't need to check any other news sources for kind of the need-to-know essential news. And so on iPad, we augmented that by still giving you that generic digest, but in addition to those stories, you then get sectional content. And so the idea behind that was, the longer session times on iPad, people tend to check it at night. It's a tablet experience. We wanted to allow people to not only read the digest that they would have had on their phone, but in order to make it not redundant like it can be with the other devices, we then add this extra content. We actually have the extra news section on the app anyway, so we've kind of glorified that with the UI. But you can go in and get technology news, entertainment news, sports news, and it's atomized, and that's what's really important. It's still summarized visually on the iPad experience. And the Katie Couric stuff you mentioned, it's been really fun working with her. She comes from more of a traditional media background, so there's been a lot of learning there. And so every Sunday morning, we provide a kind of a video segment called Now I Get It, in which she dissects the concept that's in the news at the moment, like a narrative, a storyline, and in 2-3 minutes gives you the essentials in kind of a very news digestified way. So that's been fun as well. But yeah, we launched last week. Apple featured us as their editor's choice app of the week and everything else. So we're coming #1 in the news category at the moment there, which is exciting. And I think the tablet experience should be something very cool.
So you get to tell Katie Couric what to do on a regular basis, is what you're saying.
The opposite. She's telling me, except for the UI part. No. So it's been fun working with her, and of course this whole digest concept, you know, it was very experimental when we first started out. It was kind of the antithesis of, you know, there's a lot of traditional news apps that have infinite streams of information that focus on the idea of personalization, that focus on the idea of instantaneous live information. And when I was doing this on the app, you know, almost 2 years ago now, I learned that although those things have merit and they are useful in some applications, when you have the promise, which is to deliver kind of quickly and easily, you know, 1 to 2 minutes, an update on the most important news, a summary, if you will, it's actually important to kind of go against what might feel intuitive and to come up with these ideas of, you know, definitive and finite. And actually, as you said, it's a traditional concept. It's been around for a long time.
And David, at Circa, you guys have actually been around now, what, a couple years, and you know, how is it different from what you do? I mean, you have really people writing original news stories. I mean, what Nick did was really, you know, a lot of it was kind of machine summarization. How much is what you do at Circa machine versus human?
Well, all the content is produced by humans. We have an editorial team of about 12 people distributed around the world. What's important and different about Circa is that we're not writing articles, right? We tell stories. And so we look at the news and we break it down into these essential moments. We call them basically cards, right? They're facts, quotes, statistics, events, and images, and we thread those together to tell a story. And in that way, as a story evolves, we don't have to write new articles, which often repeat themselves, or even new summaries, which again, if you are following a story over time, the summaries start to sort of trip on themselves and repeat themselves. Instead, we keep track of the what a person has or hasn't read over time and treat them with that context, right? So we would say Mark is back. He's been following this story. So here's the information that Mark doesn't know and should know because he's sort of shown interest in that story. So that's, I think, in terms of what Circa's initial focus was on. It was this idea of what does news look like if we change the structure of it for a mobile setting. We always kind of started with this idea of, the president doesn't read the news, he's briefed on it. So how can we create a sort of presidential briefing moment for everyday people?
Got it. And where are you as far as, do you have iPad apps? Are you thinking about doing that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, so we've obviously, we launched with a mobile experience first. In the works, we are going to actually be also producing a kind of desktop experience. And again, the idea is that across whatever devices people are using, we'll be able to keep track of what they have or haven't read across all those devices. And it's really easy to imagine how Circa can work again on a desktop, iPad, tablets. And even wearables. We've actually have played around with wearables as well. The idea of news at a glance, or the unit of news being, one sort of finite thing, really lends itself to wearables as well in the future.
And David, let's talk a little bit about what's going on at NYT Now. This was a first app from New York Times that brought in more aggregation. You're actually going through, not only are you choosing what people might want to see at the New York Times and what's important from your own content, but you're also aggregating stuff from around the web, and also charging, which is different than these other ones. You're charging $2 a week for people to get access. How do you see yourselves differing from what's out there in the marketplace?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think the most important thing for us was where we started, and where we started was we really, a lot of people talk about the mobile news experience or the desktop news experience, and we really said, you know what, there is such a thing as a mobile news experience, but their mobile news experience is based on the moments that a user engages with the phone. And so what we started by doing was starting by talking to lots of different users, probably over 100 over a few month period, and worked backwards and said, what are the moments that we want to win? What are the things that we think are really, really important? And, it was getting out of bed in the morning, on the commute, sitting on the couch, eating lunch, eating dinner, coming home, going to bed. And through all of those kind of things, we worked backwards to construct what we thought would be the most compelling for our users. And that was both, definitely a healthy chunk of New York Times content. We were going after an audience with an affinity for the New York Times. But it'd be naive to think that we're the only thing out there. And what we wanted to do with our product was actually, be a one-stop place at any given moment in time to know what was going on. And to do that, we knew we needed to bring in third-party content. But the one thing that's also worth saying in doing that was we didn't just want to pull it in and point to the existing headline or the summary. We actually wanted to rewrite and put the New York Times perspective over that third-party content to explain what we thought was interesting. So you could go and read it, but otherwise you could also just read through and know what was going on.
What do you have against this kind of cards or atomized news? I mean, all these aggregators seem to be into kind of summarizing things, but I mean, outside of the blurbs that you're doing, you're not really kind of constructing a new kind of aggregated story around something.
No, I mean, like I said, we started with the moments of news, and the reality is we believe there's a continuum. There's a time where people want facts. There's a time where people want a little more than facts. There's times where people want an article or a long form or an interactive graphic or a video. And so our take was, and in fact, actually, when we took a step back and talked to most users, none of them ever said, I don't want an article. In fact, they said, I want the article, but I want to be able to get through more quickly if I just want to skim and know what's going on in the world. And that's why we created the bullets with the summaries. And quite honestly, at times we pull out the facts and we put that right there on the front of the stream. Sometimes we show videos, sometimes we edit the videos down to smaller bits. But at the end of the day, we felt from a user perspective, there's not kind of a one polarizing, I just want bits of information, or I just want articles. It depends on the moment in the day.
Yeah, Andrew, I'm curious, what do you think after kind of playing around with all these apps? They seem like they all have kind of a just slightly different take on what we want with our news, but what's interesting is unlike kind of the first generation with Flipboard and Zite and some others, they're not quite as personalized. It's like almost a step back from personalization. I mean, there's someone deciding, especially when you think of Yahoo News Digest and NYT Now, they're literally deciding what they think is important for us.
Yeah, I mean, this is especially interesting to me because this is actually something I'm writing about now for my next book, is what happens after the initial news cycle is over, right? And because what I've written about is mainly Wikipedia, Wikipedia has been that main resource that people go to. Like, how do you understand all the things that happened with ISIS or ISIL over the last few weeks or months? If you go to the Wikipedia article on this, then you get a good summary of everything that happens, including a history of the movement and what kind of things are happening now. And I think for the longest time, news organizations have been a little bit, I don't want to say frustrated, but they see how they're the first reporters of the news, but they really don't take part in that second step, and Wikipedia kind of had that space to itself. So it's really cool to see all these new startup ideas trying to look at that space after the news has happened and say, how can we be the folks that people go to for the context, for the digest, for the analysis? And you see that with Vox.com, you see that with Circa, you see it with Trove, something that was started out at Washington Post Labs. And it's really great to see all that experimentation, because for the longest time, people thought it was just, wow, Wikipedia does that great. It's a nonprofit. They've got the crowd to help with this. But how can news organizations or for-profit entities capitalize on that opportunity to deliver the digest or the context to the audience? And some folks have said we can come up with algorithms that do that. As David mentioned, they have a crew of folks. And I remember, I think when I talked to you earlier on when Circa was starting, you want to make sure there was always someone awake in your editing team around the world as the globe spun. And I think that's probably still your concept of making sure that there are humans, awake 24 hours a day at some point around the globe to make sure that that curation and that contextualization is happening through human editors.
And David Cohn, how does it evolve? I mean, Circa, you have the kind of card metaphor that we talk about and the kind of atoms. Does it go beyond that? I mean, does it go into video? Do you go into other areas, or do you try to keep it pretty simple?
Right now, we keep it pretty simple, but it's not hard to imagine. I mean, again, I mentioned the kinds of cards we have: facts, quotes, statistics, events, and images. that's not to say that this is the end and we're done with all the types of cards that can be created. It's really easy to imagine, video cards, audio cards, sort of tweets or Instagram, social media type cards, and beyond, right? I mean, I look at them as right now kind of they're all facts, right? There's facts. Quotes is the fact that someone said something. Statistics is facts as numbers. And again, sometimes video is a first-person video is a fact of what it was caught on screen. And to sort of follow up with what Andrew talked about, and I'm thinking about this from Circa's perspective, of course, is this idea again of context and sort of historically we had thought that the best way to do that is to sit down and read 2,000, 3,000 words in one sitting. And at Circa, one story can evolve over weeks, over months. And so while you're only reading maybe 300, 400 characters in any one moment, if you are following that story over a month, over 2 months, we just updated a story that was from 2012, you actually do read 3,000, 4,000 words, and I think that you get a really deep, rich understanding of not just what's happening right now, but what that means in historical context.
And what about the business model involved? How does Circa kind of see itself as a business?
Sure. So the first and easiest, sort of way to understand that we could make money in the future would be around advertising, not sort of traditional banner ads. I think I imagine everybody on the panel would agree that mobile banner ads would just be kind of pointless and a bad experience. The way we kind of picture it, there's a couple different ways. The one that I'm most excited about is the idea of sponsored content that is aesthetically treated differently, so it's transparent that it is sponsored, but it behaves like a Circa story, so it can be teased out over time. So I imagine like a story sponsored by Marvel about the Avengers 2 coming out in 2015, and it's maybe 3 points, right? And then in another month, they release a photo of one of the actors in a costume, right? And then in 2 months after that, a video point of a trailer. Whatever they want to do to tell that story, and then on, whenever it's released, right? And again, because someone might be following that story, that creates an intimate relationship between the sponsor of that content and the reader, right? They get a push to their phone, which is a very intimate object. And so that is a much more valuable advertising experience than, again, just a banner ad, which I think most users would ignore.
Yeah, so you're talking about kind of a native advertising approach. Mm-hmm. And Nick, with Yahoo News Digest, you started to see some little kind of sponsored, the atoms within a story or sponsored or ads. Where do you think that might go?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, the format of our news articles, having a multi-document summary at the top within these atoms, these units of information, it lends itself to native advertising within that. It's not obtrusive to a user to have one of those native atoms actually be an advert that's relevant, pertinent to the storyline, because of the way they're used to having the page laid out modularized. So at the moment, we're not really focused on monetization at all. Philosophically, the goal of this product, as I was saying, is to kind of inform the user. And I kind of the metaphor I like to use is the idea of like vegetables. It's like our products, like you've got to eat your vegetables. You've got to have news that you don't necessarily want to know about, but you need to know about. And so everything about the product, from the modernist user interface and design, right down to the idea of having a digest, which is a meta summary, and kind of having a completion moment where it literally goes green and says you're done, and you don't have to check it for another 12 hours. I'm reminded of a Dieter Rams quote, less is better. We are trying to simplify the news process. And in terms of, like, in reaction to the idea of kind of following a story over a weekly period, that's not what Yahoo News Digest is about at all. We're kind of we're the opposite of that. We're about giving you the news that is most important and essential that you need to know. And if that news story is no longer in the public eye as being very important, even if you're interested in it, then we're not the place to come to. Our delivery is just twice a day the most important storyline. And so when I first started something in 2011 and stuff, people weren't really talking about summarization. I originally came up with the summarization algorithm for revising for history exams and Google and Wikipedia. I mean, news and summarization didn't really go together at all. No one was talking about this. And it's only with the introduction of smaller screens, and now we're going to the wearables, where summarization seems to become this buzzword. And I do not see it as being pejorative at all. Some people are saying they don't do summarization here or anything. I think we all summarize every day when we're having a conversation, when we're ingesting and learning information. And the key with Digest is we're trying to make learning and understanding of the stories that are in the news as well very easy to understand. So from a Digest perspective, in terms of monetization, we're excited about the Apple Watch as well. We were working with Apple a few weeks before they announced the watch on a Digest-like thing there, and so we're excited when that obviously comes out to really kind of put our foot in the door with very hyper-summarized information.
So we'll talk about wearables and the watch in a minute. I'm just curious from what David said, David Cohn said about native ads, would you actually have, I know you've got the Atoms sponsored, would you actually have a story that's in kind of a native ad? No, you're shaking your head.
It would be lying to our users in a sense because of our promise, which is to kind of provide you, I mean, we take it very seriously when we select those stories in the digest. It is not just algorithmic. We use the algorithms to kind of help produce and synthesize those atoms. But when it comes to the selection of the stories, you have to incorporate things like nuance and understanding of what's important and not. So we have editors that help with that, and we wouldn't, a false positive in the system being sent to users, which isn't important, or people are like, why is that in my digest? That would kill the product immediately. So we take that very seriously, what stories are above that threshold or below it.
And David Perpich, what about, I mean, it's $2 a week for people to get NYT Now, and what is your view on kind of advertising or native advertising? Is that a possibility down the road?
Yeah, in fact, we actually have already native advertising built in. Speaking of native, there's kind of inline advertising, and then there's kind of the advertising that when you click on it, it takes you to content, it looks like content. And quite honestly, I think, as I think David was saying earlier, the banner ads are a crappy experience, and we're excited that we're not doing that. And I think with native ads, it gives people a chance to go by, and if they want, they can click through and read more, but it's way more relevant and actually fits, I think, much better into the user experience.
Now, David Cohn, I know when Nick was saying, people sometimes demonize summarization, you might be guilty of that. You just wrote this post, I guess, a while ago saying, Circa does not summarize. I mean,
right. I wouldn't say that
summarization.
Sure. I wouldn't say that I have anything against it. It's just not for Circa. I mean, one way that I would put it is like, a summary of the Boston Marathon bombing is something like, two brothers, set off bombs at the end of the Boston Marathon. A couple of people were injured and killed. One of the brothers was shot and killed. One of the brothers was captured. That's a summary of the Boston Marathon bombing, but it's not a story, right? And I think what Circa wants to do is really tell a story. So we want to do that in a concise way, but we see a difference between breaking down stories into these atomic units, into the moments that move the story forward, versus a summary of the story, right? And I think that there is value to summaries, and just as there is values to telling stories that evolve over time. And that's what I think Circa focuses on, is not just sort of, again, capturing a brief overview, a 10,000-foot view of something, but really allowing that story to sort of get room over time. We are also, Circa 3 is going to be coming out relatively soon, and we're also working on something that, again, this idea of the presidential brief, right? Right now, the way Circa works is you sort of say, I want to follow this, and then essentially that's like the president telling an aide, keep me informed on this, and we will do that. But, again, the president is briefed on things that maybe he or she didn't know was important. So we are going to be also working on a product that will very concretely define the important things that someone should know in that day, coming soon.
Okay, fair enough. So, Nick, you talked a little bit about wearables. I know it's on all of our minds after the big reveal from Apple. And one thing we noticed in that announcement was that there was a Yahoo News Digest kind of a little, icon as part of that announcement. So you've had some access to the watch, I guess, ahead of some others, and you talked a little bit about, what you might do there, that it fits so well, but how much can you fit on a watch? I mean, what exactly would be there? Would there be a headline? I mean, how much text? How are you figuring out exactly how to fit it in such a small real estate of screen?
I mean, we're still going through a lot of the ideation process, so nothing's set in stone. What I'm excited about is the finitude of the digest layer, that meta layer. So not so much the story layer, where you do have the summary and we have those units of information, and it's a beautiful experience on a phone and a tablet. But the layer above that, which is kind of like, these are the most important stories you need to know about, getting that moment of completion. So it would be more of a headline-like experience, but we can offer that deliverance in that you can still check your digest on the watch and be informed, even if the content is slightly more summarized. So we're still exploring with an interesting thing about the Apple Watch and what we're really excited about is also the session lens. And so you really do need summarization on a watch. I mean, there is no way around this. You cannot caveat that in any other way. And And I really see this as like an end to where I was starting with something a long time ago, which is there is finally a need for very algorithmic, very condensed, very refined summarization. Because of the screen real estate, it is that small. And so obviously we'll be announcing stuff next year when it comes out and everything else. But we're taking it very seriously, both from the algorithmic standpoint and also the selection of the stories. Do we shorten the digest? Do we think about even a layer beyond the digest, like a summary of summaries of summary? You know, there's a lot of really exciting stuff. We're going to play it by ear.
And David Perpich, what do you think about wearables and the watch? I know in the past Apple has kind of featured the New York Times and some of its products, but wasn't on this one. But how do you feel NYT Now could fit, or some sort of something specifically for the Apple Watch?
Sure. Well, it's something we're talking about internally. I mean, I don't have a great answer for you. I mean, my answer would probably mimic somewhat of Nick's, which is, I think there's a way to extract the information up even a layer more than we're currently doing and display that on the watch. I mean, there's a lot of stuff which Yahoo News Digest wouldn't do around breaking news that I think is really interesting that you can do leveraging the watch. And, photos, videos, other things as well. So all conversations we're having currently.
So you feel like it might be almost a more visual thing because you're not going to be able to read a ton of text on it. You might just want a quick visual.
Yeah, I mean, it's. Once again, I haven't had a chance to play with it myself, but those are the kind of things that we're talking about here.
And David Cohn, also, I know you guys are now thinking about wearables as well. I mean, how do you see this? I guess a new atom would kind of pop up, a new update about the story, like what you do at Circa. I'm guessing it would be the same idea, but just on a smaller form factor.
Yeah, and it's still, a little early. We're also in the ideation, sort of playing with it. I think we would want to try and figure out what are the most important aspects of the Circa experience that would translate really well to a wearable. I think breaking news really lends itself when it's just a flash, and I hate to use a morbid example, but they often are of, a shooting has happened at some place. And then the ability to follow right at that moment, and then again, as more information comes out, these bite-sized atomic units, as well as perhaps the ability to again get the sort of the daily briefing, the core elements of what are the most important stories of the day, and just again the ability from that moment to say keep me informed on it, or move on and wait until tomorrow's most important stories.
Andrew, what do you think about the potential here with wearables and the watch? It seems like maybe you get a flash, maybe you get something visual on the watch, and maybe if you want to read more, you'd go to your phone. So maybe it's something that works in tandem with your smartphone.
Yeah, I think what's interesting is a lot of these experiments in summarizing and digestifying all took place on the mobiles, right? Because it's a smaller screen, you don't have ready access to tabs and opening up multiple windows, so by necessity, well, not by necessity, but it was really driven by the form factor. And I think that having wearables with even smaller screens, but in front of your eyeballs even more than the mobile, will have huge implications in terms of where developers put their efforts into creating things that will be useful for news consumption. So I look forward to that innovation where, right now, even with something as convenient as this, it might be in your pants pocket, it might be in your purse, and you might not actually do this, but to just twist your arm like that suddenly, and you get whatever can come up on your watch face is going to be really interesting to see what designers come up with to make that fast, efficient, and responsive to gestures and all kinds of other environmental input.
I think just to second on it, what's really interesting that Andrew talked about is the idea that the two are in tandem or in sync, right? The same person who might be getting information on their phone, on their watch, also has a phone, and so the ability to sort of, sync the two up, right? I guess the way that I would say it is, Circa started off, very much as a mobile phone news company, but we see ourselves as a mobile lifestyle company, right? We're about the mobile lifestyle, people on the go between various devices, and to be able to have an experience that respects that across various devices, as people will probably have both, right, a watch and a phone on them at all times, will become increasingly, I think, interesting and important to leverage.
And before we go, I want to also quickly talk a little bit about Al Jazeera has a new news app called AJ Plus, and they really take the kind of brief, kind of almost meme-like news putting in short videos, putting in quick explainers. I mean, it's a very visual, very fast-paced kind of effort. I'm wondering if any of you had a chance to play around with it and had any thoughts about it.
I did play around with it. I think it's interesting. Again, they have their own take on it as well, so it seems like everyone has their own take or perspective on news. And again, the ideas are similar, the summarization, kind of bringing everything, clustering together. So it's interesting. I think visually it is quite complex if you play around with it, definitely from a UI design standpoint. There's a lot of things happening. I'm not sure that, again, on a mobile experience is what you want. You want it Euro refined and quick, but it's interesting and it's fun to see their take on it. It's an interesting looking at.
Yeah, and it seems like something that is targeted to kind of younger people or shorter attention spans or something to kind of get your attention and make you pay attention to news that maybe you wouldn't have. Like taking this idea of taking a serious subject and kind of explaining it, maybe dumbing it down a little bit. I mean, you're doing a little bit of that with Katie Quirk and having an explainer, right?
Yeah, with that, but also I think that the premise of Digest in general was to kind of inform a younger. I mean, we tried to make the app from the pseudo gamification of the product down to the visuals, the UI, the simplification of the multi-document summary, and then the ability, if you want to read the original sources and go in depth. You know, I'm not against in depth, but the kind of the younger millennial-like person who doesn't have money but still wants to be intelligent. You know, we like to talk about dinner party news, or it is similar to the presidential briefing in a sense, but it's probably slightly more colloquial than that. It's slightly more simpler, but it's just like for anyone who wants to be informed across these wide array of topics, giving a younger person that ability within 2 minutes. You know, 2-minute session time, that was the goal. But this is an interesting app. Yeah, it's a different angle, I think.
Any other thoughts? Anybody else have thoughts about the Al Jazeera effort?
I mean, it's a really well done app. I mean, it's very visual. It's not just text or video. It's got infographics. It has polls. It has things that it tries to get you to do. My only real complaint about it right now is that there is auto-playing video with very loud audio. So I just
gets your attention.
Yeah, well, not only attention, but it just annoyed the room that I was in right here. So it is something that's easy to tweak, but hopefully they learn that auto-playing video, not a good idea in general. But I think they're really using the medium really well. You know, they respect the size of the device, and they are filling it with really nicely done infographics and things that draw the eye in. So it's a pretty impressive app.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, so, you know, I have played with it, and, you know, there's elements of now this news in it, elements of Vox, you know, I think elements of you know, this idea of atomization, maybe a little bit of what Circa is doing. What I find interesting about it, you know, I mean, certainly in a whole other many podcasts that you probably had, you know, the last decade, you know, the journalism community has been very interested in what does engagement look and feel like. And that has very much also focused on a desktop, and I think what AJ Plus is doing is saying, you know, just as, you know, all of us on the panel are looking at news and how does that, you know, more, you know, form to mobile, they're looking at that conversation of engagement and, you know, participation with the audience. How does that transform and look and feel on mobile, which is a really interesting kind of space to pull, right? It's an interesting thread to see how far it'll go.
No doubt.
Oh, I was just going to say quickly that you know, the thing that's interesting about AJ Plus to me is, while I really like the content, I actually found myself getting lost in the little explainers and them being really, really well done. The thing that was kept finding myself wondering is, like, when would I come to this, and the right moment in the time. What's the right habit to build around this? And that's one of the things, honestly, I think Yahoo News Digest has done really well, and something that we've been doing as well in NYT Now. Just going to the description even of this panel, there's so many news apps out there. How do you decide which one to go to and in which context? And I think that's the thing I'll be interested to see with them, is how do they build in those right times where people want to come and get that really great 3-minute explainer, and how do they build that into the news stream?
No question. I mean, there are so many news apps out there, and for the consumer, it's, you know, this feels like a time of kind of weeding out, where people are going to make their decision on their attention. They only have so much attention. They can't look at every app every day. So this is really a time of building habits for everyone and what they're going to use for their news on mobile and maybe even on wearables. So thanks a lot, everyone. I appreciate you joining us for the podcast. I want to thank our guests, Andrew Lih at American University, David Cohn at Circa, David Perpich at the New York Times, Nick DeLisio at Yahoo News Digest, and Fannie Cohen, our producer. I want to thank our sponsor, NextSpace, Potrero Hill, and Next Kids, Potrero Hill. You can learn more about their program at bit.ly/NextSpacePH. I want to thank PBS and the Knight Foundation for making this podcast possible. We'll catch you each and every Friday right here on the Mediatwits. Thanks, everyone.